most economists think that the lack of formal property rights to land, especially, is one of the main hindrances to development in indigenous areas. And the basic idea is that informal use rights are too insecure to promote investment and prudent use of land. And so this idea is pervasive. It was the guiding philosophy behind the U.S. allotment of Native American lands that Dustin told us about earlier. I'll just read this quote from the Act's sponsor, Henry Dawes. He said, "Indians had not got as far as they can go because they own their land in common. And under that system, there is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbors." So the solution to this common property problem is pretty clear, and it's to strengthen future claims on current investment, and you do that by strengthening property rights. In particular, you create exclusion rights so that others can't benefit from investments you make today in the future. Okay, so that's specifically strengthen exclusion rights. That's the solution to this problem. And just to add a little more meat to this idea, there's different ways you can imagine privatization or enclosure of the commons taking place. But in this little schematic, I have area A. It's an agricultural landscape. We imagine end users, end holders of use rights. Under the common property regime, there's some group exclusion rights, so it's not pure open access. It's common property. There's end users, and all those users can use the land. And the predicted effect by standard economic models is you have underinvestment in the productivity of the land, which is why I colored this brown. So you had a visualization of that. And so a solution to that problem is to enclose the commons. And roughly speaking, there's two ways to do it. You could create a big private estate and create one use right and one exclusion right. So here there's end use rights, but nobody has individual exclusion rights. You can't prevent people from harvesting from your investment. But here you could privatize the whole estate, like the English enclosure movement did, and grant it to giant landholdings and use a tenant farming kind of system. And there's problems with that, but it is one way to try to solve the common property problem. What we see is a lot more common. It happened in the allotment of Native American lands. It's related to what happened in the Homestead Act that we just heard about. In Kenya, lots of places of the world, privatization usually works by subdividing common property, strengthening individual exclusion rights to a particular parcel. And so this landscape in panel C is all private parcels, and there's end use rights and end exclusion rights. Each individual has a use right, each has an exclusion right. As long as those parcel sizes are roughly appropriate for agricultural use and they're not too small, you could predict with a simple model that you'd have just as much investment and just as much productivity in the land under C as you would have with B. But C is a lot more politically feasible, and that's what we observe happening with most modern privatization movements. So without debating the importance of individual private property and exclusion rights for land investment and agricultural productivity, we want to ask the question if this kind of subdivision scheme has unintended consequences. And our motivating literature for why it might is this literature on anti-commons, it's called. I'll say more about that in a moment. The anti-commons literature is championed probably most conspicuously by Michael Heller. Michael Heller is a law professor at the University of Michigan. He wrote a highly cited paper in 1998, one in Science, one in a law review, where he starts with the puzzle of the lack of use of Russian stores in the wake of privatization, the fall of the Soviet Union. And the puzzle is that these stores weren't being used, and there was really active kiosks operating right in front of the stores. And his answer to why those stores were underused is that too many individuals had exclusion rights. And it created all this gridlock, and the cost of contracting for use of the store was extremely high. And so then he goes on to make a more general argument that too much privatization can destroy wealth, and it can be socially inefficient. And one of the leading examples of where this might happen is in patent law. So you have a bunch of innovators. They hold individual pieces of rights that if you could collect those rights as an entrepreneur and combine them, you could come up with a really important technology. But the gridlock of combining those private rights prevents that from happening. So this is kind of our background motivation, but we want to think more in a more spatial way, if you will. And we're introducing a term that we're calling spatial anti-commons. And we're going to argue that solving the common problem property for agriculture may create anti-commons problems, not for agriculture necessarily, but for other resources. And the spatial anti-commons problem for us arises whenever the profitable scale of the resource use is greater than the number of exclusion rights. So here I have this circle, and it denotes a large-scale resource, one with high fixed costs of starting up. We can imagine oil shale development, which is the focus of our paper. You can imagine wind energy. You could imagine other large-scale resources. But the key is that when land is subdivided into private parcels, that frustrates the management of the larger scale resource that requires coordination among, in this case, about N holders of exclusion rights. So you got to coordinate with each other, recombine those rights in order to manage the large scale resource. And if you can't do it, we want to call that an anti-commons. So our study it's about how top-down privatization via subdivision affected the timing, the density, and the pattern of oil shale development on U.S. reservations, but we're focused on one in particular. We examine a data set of 40,000-ish parcel-level data on and around Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. It's in North Dakota. It sits atop the Bakken oil field, which is one of the world's most productive oil fields. It's booming right now. It's been booming since about 2005-ish. And the key thing about the Bakken and oil shale in general is that it's efficiently and profitably, the oil is profitably require a big fixed cost of drilling a vertical portion of the well, and then the efficient scale of these wells usually extends to about 2 miles. So the point being, with this technology, it's necessary in a subdivided landscape to contract with all the owners of the shale underneath the landscape, and so it can create an anti-commons problem. Also importantly is the endowments of these oil shale is plausibly, and in most cases I think pretty clearly, exogenous to land tenure arrangements. So I'll get to that in a moment. But that's what we're doing. This is the Fort Berthold Reservation that I've drawn with an arrow. That's in North Dakota. Luckily for us, Dustin told us all about the Land Allotment Act earlier, so hearing these details a second time might make it easier to digest. The Fort Berthold Reservation, the surface, and it turns out the subsurface rights were subdivided. The process got started through the General Allotment Act. Subdivision through that act was typically in 320, 160, 80, and 40 acre parcels. 160 acres for a family in an arable region, a region with decent farmland like North Dakota, but 80 acres would go to a single individual that was over 18, and 40 acres would go to a child, somebody under 18. So you get these different size parcels. Some of them are squares, some of them are more rectangular, which is actually important. We'll tell you why later. Land is privatized when the allottee was deemed competent. These surplus lands, after all the land was subdivided and privatized, whatever was left over was open for homesteading settlement, as you heard earlier. Importantly, in 1934, the allotted land that was not yet privatized was frozen into trust. And so this process created three types of tenure that we analyzed in our case study. One is tribal land, typically land that was never subdivided and is still owned in common by the tribe and managed through their governments. Fee simple land, which is private property, one owner, one exclusion right. And then this intermittent category, which is hard to categorize, we call it allotted trust. We actually flip-flop in our terminology in the paper because we couldn't decide what to call it. I don't want to call it individual trust because that's misleading, because the feature of allotted trust, the important feature about it from our perspective is that there's multiple owners, sometimes 50, sometimes 75, that all hold exclusion rights to use on that parcel. So allotted trust, as I'll talk about later, exasperate this anti-commons problem that we're talking about. The Allotment Act carved up parcels at the surface, but it also, in general, without getting into gory details, in general, ownership of the subsurface followed the demarcation of the surface property lines. And that's certainly true in the case we study, and it's not always true, but it's generally true of the allotment process. Okay. So our case study is about the Fort Berthold Reservation, and this map shows you mineral tenure on that reservation, and mineral tenure generally follows the surface tenure. Okay, so what do we need to know about Fort Berthold? Probably less than what I have here, but I'll tell you that the allotment process initiated in 1894. This northeast section of the reservation that's green is all fee simple land. That was surplus land. It was opened for settlement. It's fee simple land, and it's mostly owned by non-natives. 1910s, the U.S. Geological Survey surveyed this land this reservation looking for oil and gas potential, and found none. Okay, so you get allotment that's happening, land being deemed surplus before there's any indication that there's oil and gas under the reservation. In 1947, a project that occurred in 1951 was planned, and the reservation was flooded by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a sad piece of history. Tribal members were relocated away from the flood line. But because of that flooding, a lot of the land around the river was first granted to the U.S. government, but then it was re-granted to the tribe. So now you have tribal land, or tribal mineral tenure and tribal land. Around the river, it's not underwater. A lot of it's not underwater, but it was at the initial part of the flooding. Oil discovered in 1951, and a lot of these allotted parcels, which are in blue, as I was saying earlier, have multiple owners. 87% of those, according to a survey in 1992, had more than 2 owners. A lot of them had 20, 30, 40 owners. Okay. The Bakken oil boom begins in 2005. Okay, Jane, maybe that's more than I needed to say about this. This is the background. Okay, so we're looking at how this subdivision of land and the different tenure systems has affected the uptake of oil and gas drilling in different parts of the reservation. And as I pointed out earlier, horizontal drilling, this kind of fracking that's taking place, a large fixed cost to drill a vertical portion of the well. The well barrels into, maybe the center of the oil shale, where the shale is tightly trapped, and then a horizontal line is drilled, and so there's a big fixed cost and then an increasing marginal cost of line length. And that gives you, at least conceptually, something like H star, which is the technologically optimal line length. And roughly speaking, we're going to say it's about 2 miles. Well, 2 miles, to give you an idea of the number of exclusion rights through even just fee simple parcels, is 2 miles would equal 16 40-acre square parcels. So if the ownership claims are respected down to the subsurface, you would have to get permission from 16 people to drill this technologically optimally length line of H star. Okay, so the number of exclusion rights to a drilling project of length H star depends on 2 things. It depends on how finely subdivided the parcels are, how big they are. Are they 40 acres, 160 acres, 320? And it also depends on what kind of tenure we're talking about. So if you just start with fee simple, 1 exclusion right per parcel, the number of exclusion rights for that parcel would just be 1 if a parcel was large enough to contain a well that's H star length or 2 miles. And then as you extend to 2 parcels, 3, 4, the number of exclusion rights just rises linearly. With allotted land, the slope is steeper if we assume that each allotted parcel has more than 1 owner, more than 1 holder of exclusion rights. Say they have Z holders. And so if you start and say, I don't know, there's 5 exclusion rights, even if there's 1 giant allotted trust parcel that would fully contain this horizontal line, you have this many exclusion rights, and then that rises at a steeper slope. It's just the number of excluders. Tribal is different because this idea of parcelization of contiguous tribal land doesn't really even make much sense because it's the same owner. The tribe owns the land, and so you could, I don't know, fictitiously think of it as a parcel, but it's really a swath of land. And so as you extend parcelization of tribal lands, you're not adding any more to the number of excluders. Okay, so that's sort of the marginal, the increase in excluders as you subdivide the landscape. But there's also something like, the number of exclusion rights just to get a parcel started. And so we're drawing this kind of arbitrarily here, but we're putting the tribal intercept above the fee and allotted. And the idea is that to get a project started on government land or tribal land, you're going to need permission from various agencies, various authorities. In the U.S., it'd be federal agencies, agencies within the tribe, different groups. And so to get a project started, there's more exclusion rights that you have to work through. But once you get it started on tribal land, you're not increasing that, okay? So the number of excluders, even on private land, if the landscape is subdivided finely, you have more excluders at some point if subdivision is so narrow. Okay, I think I beat that to death perhaps. So our empirical analysis is looking at how subdivision affects the timing and the extent of oil and gas development on a parcel. And so to motivate our empirical analysis, we just assume that the contracting costs or the transaction costs of the project are directly related to the number of excluders. And so if you have to go through a bunch of different parcels, at some point, the cost of a project through fee simple parcels is going to exceed the revenues. And that's PF here. And so we would predict too much subdivision, you ultimately won't have a drilling project here. Allotted requires less subdivision because the number of excluders increases at a faster rate. If there is a resource, an input that's scarce, like a drilling rig, then this gives us predictions about the timing of drilling. So an oil company would drill big fee parcels first, then big allotted parcels. At some point, it would get to a point where it would prefer to drill exclusively through tribal land than subdivided, allotted, and fee zones. And so that's what sets up our empirical work. We've collected parcel level data for these counties around the Fort Berthold Reservation. So we have about 40,000-ish parcels. These are oil fields. So we overlay information about the oil endowments with the surface characteristics. We argue in the paper that at least once you condition on oil field fixed effects, these small areas where regulations concerning oil fields are homogeneous, once you condition on those, we find no differences across tenure type in a measure of shale quality, which is thickness to depth ratio. But we claim that there's pretty good evidence that shale quality is exogenous to tenure. And then we collect these data from the North Dakota Oil and Gas Commission. It is one of the cooler data sets I've ever worked with. Brian works with cool data sets all the time, so maybe it's not the coolest for him. But it's GIS shape files of the direction of horizontal drilling lines and the location of the vertical bores. And so from this, we create some outcome variables. One is just an indicator if there's been drilling, if there's been a line undercutting a parcel. That's our best measure of whether the owner has been paid for his or her endowment. If you get a line under you, you're most likely been compensated for your endowment. That about 34% of the parcels in this sample have a line through it as of 2015. And then to measure delays, we look at the number of days from January 1st, 2005 until the present to look at how tenure and subdivision has affected delays. We look at some other outcomes. To measure contracting costs, we include the size of a parcel. Larger parcels mean fewer exclusion rights. We measure the, yes? Yeah. The blue dots are the vertical portion of the well, and the lines are the horizontal portion of the well. So 34% of these parcels have a line through it, but about 7% have a blue dot in them. We've blown it up so you can see it, but
some of the
this is
are purely vertical wells, like old school traditional vertical wells, so the ones that don't have the line next to them.
but most of them are well bores of a horizontal drilling unit.
So you're saying this is only 30% of the parcels here? I mean, this looks
34% of the parcels have a line undercutting it.
way more than that figure, but
I think it's because we've blown it up to like the lines are thicker, they're not to scale.
Okay.
But this has been
It's like most of the drilling is happening on individual sort of allotted trust and not like. So, what's the position of the tribe itself on fracking? Is there,
They wanna
it's like
you mean-
they're not happy with what's going on, or I'm reading this wrong. There's nothing on tribal land, or why is that?
well part of the
Is it on the river, or?
part of it is because it's on the river. Part of it is it doesn't have shale under it. So like this whole eastern part of the reservation doesn't have shale on it. So that's part of it. But I'd say the tribe's position is they want to drill.
They wanna-
Yeah.
to develop.
So our measures of contracting costs is the size of the parcel, holding constant the size. If you extend the long side of the parcel, you're creating a skinnier, narrower parcel. And so that's more conducive for horizontal drilling. The optimal shape for a farming parcel is probably a square, but for horizontal drilling and other linear land uses, it's a rectangle. And then we create a variable for the number of parcels in a 1 mile radius of parcel I. And as that increases, holding constant the 1 mile radius, that tells you the landscape's more subdivided. So 2 regressions I'll show you and then I'll be done. This is a Tobit estimate of the number of days elapsed between the start of the fracking boom and the first line. So larger parcels get fracked first, longer parcels get fracked first. No significant relationship between if the parcels on the reservation are off in terms of the timing that it's fracked. Controls for different covariates that we think would affect the net value of drilling a parcel. If we go to tenure, oops, I skipped this one. That's all right, I'll skip that one. Now we're looking at the effects of subdivision specific by tenure type. And if you add another fee neighbor in the 1 mile radius, the number of days, the delay increases by 7.3 days. If you add another allotted truss neighbor, the length of the delay increases by about 15 days. But if you add another tribal neighbor, there's no increased delay, which is consistent with our idea that tribal land is conducive for these large-scale projects. So that's what we have so far. It's a summary. There's kind of more data work in the paper and some other things that are still in progress. In terms of our conclusions, I'll just point out in this literature on anti-commons, Michael Heller wrote this book in 2008, and he kind of thinks anti-commons are everywhere. They're affecting land, they're affecting resource use and gridlocks everywhere. But he says it's a really hard thing to identify because there's usually nothing to show. How does one see something that has never existed? The lack of a new drug, the lack of an enterprise. And so I'm going to claim that we have a nice test of the anti-commons, and the anti-commons itself is pretty hard to test. So that's one claim that I think we're prepared to make. But in terms of this setting, I'll say it's evidence, it's a cautionary tale of top-down privatization. Subdividing the commons can frustrate large-scale resource management. Well, when is this important? Well, when valuable resources have to be managed at large scales, that's kind of obvious. But also when the large-scale resource is undiscovered or unknown when privatization occurs. So I think this is the case of oil shale. It was unknown or not valuable when privatization happened. I think it would be true of wind energy today. No one envisioned wind to be a valuable resource. Wind is likely exogenous to most privatization processes, but subdividing land could frustrate wind development. And it also matters in areas of the world where farming isn't so valuable, but a large-scale resource is really valuable, like Saudi Arabia, I guess. Of course, the scale advantages of tribes and governments are conditioned by the quality of governance. We're talking about one reservation. There's collective action problems that the tribe has to overcome, or any government has to overcome. And we wonder what the contemporary relevance of this is to privatization proposals today, such as ones we think are being discussed in Canada. And certainly we think this is relevant for wind energy development on U.S. Indian reservations, which is one resource reservations have and may not be able to tap because some of these fragmentation problems. People seem to clap at the other presentation. Thank you.